In 1954, the Lockheed Constellation represented the peak of mid-century aviation. On the tarmac, the aircraft is defined by meticulous detail. The gleam of its polished aluminum and the rows of period-accurate rivets give it the crisp, clean finish of a premium vintage die-cast model. Santiago Flight 513 was a routine entry on the morning schedule. Boarding was entirely mundane. Passengers found their seats, stowed their luggage, and the flight crew completed their checklists without a single warning sign from the four engines. Ground crews watched from the edge of the runway as the aircraft began its roll. It accelerated smoothly, lifting away from the earth in a textbook ascent that looked identical to every other departure that day. The Constellation climbed steadily, its four propellers churning the air as it leveled out to establish its scheduled flight path over the Atlantic. This flawless, unremarkable departure is the very thing that makes the events of the next hour impossible to reconcile. Inside the air traffic control tower, the atmosphere was quiet. Operators monitored the flight's progress through the analog tools of the era, tracking a standard journey that required no special attention. Then the radar swept across the coordinates. The blip was gone. There was no preceding altitude drop and no distress call, just a sudden, total absence of a signal. Operators immediately tried to hail the cockpit, but their calls were met with nothing but 1950s radio static. They toggled through frequencies, searching for any sign that the pilot was still in the air. On the ground, the silence became deafening. A massive commercial airliner had disappeared, yet there were no witnesses to a crash, no oil slicks on the water, and not a single piece of floating debris to mark its location. The plane didn't leave a trace of a struggle or a mechanical failure. It simply vanished from the physical world, beginning a 35-year silence. By 1989, the aviation world had shifted into a digital era. In this modernized tower, air traffic control was managed through high-resolution screens and computerized tracking systems. An unidentified aircraft suddenly materialized on the radar. It carried no transponder signal and failed to respond to every digital hail from the tower. The imposing shape of a Lockheed Constellation descended from the clouds and touched down on the dark runway, its engines slowing as it taxied toward the terminal. When the plane finally came to a stop, the ground crew saw a machine that appeared weathered and oxidized. The once polished aluminum was gone, replaced by a surface that looked brittle and dead. The state of the airframe suggested it had been exposed to the elements for decades, making the fact that it had just executed a perfect mechanical landing a physical impossibility. The ground crew approached the silent, unpowered aircraft with extreme caution. Under the harsh runway lights, the heavy shadows stretching across the fuselage made the plane look like a ghost ship. It took several men to force open the rusted cabin doors. When the seal finally broke, a wave of cold, stagnant air rushed out into the night. Flashlights cut through the darkness of the cabin, revealing that every single seat was occupied by a skeleton. The cabin was entirely silent. There was no sign of a struggle, no oxygen masks hanging from the ceiling, and no indication that anyone on board had realized they were dying. These discoveries effectively ruled out every conventional theory of aviation failure. The interior of the plane offered no logical answers, only a deepening supernatural mystery. Investigators eventually moved past the passenger cabin and entered the cockpit of the aircraft. They found the captain still strapped into his seat. His skeletal hands were still wrapped around the flight controls. A flight requires a living crew to manage the throttle and steer the landing gear. Here, a deeply corroded, unpowered machine had been guided to a safe landing by men who had been dead for 35 years. Despite the physical evidence of the plane's return, there is no scientific explanation for where it spent the intervening decades. Santiago Flight 513 remains an anomaly outside the known laws of time, a physical artifact that by every measure of science never should have landed.